All right, you guys, we're coming to the end of the day and our last panel, which is the best one. This is the scary one, the Ooga Booga panel. We are going to talk about ethical adaptation and artificial intelligence. It's my honor to introduce our closing hitter, Duncan Crabtree Ireland, our National Executive Director and Chief Negotiator. In that role, Duncan leads bargaining across our contracts, leads our internal and external technology efforts, and is a speaker who has appeared at numerous panels, conferences, and is a thought leader on technology overall, but in particular on artificial intelligence, deep fakes, and how that impacts digital image rights, and particularly actors and others in the entertainment industry. Take it away, Duncan.
Thank you so much, Pam. So exciting to be taking on this topic this afternoon. And I think we can tell by the conversations we've had earlier today that the ethics of how technology and labor intersect are really one of the most important issues that we can take up. Automation, artificial intelligence, and other emerging technologies, are pushing society down a path that will change how we live, communicate, and work. There are constant revolutionary breakthroughs going on that can have the potential to make our lives better, easier, and more convenient. But this progress has potential downsides as well. These technological breakthroughs have in fact already displaced and in some cases outright replaced workers, making some occupations more difficult and depressing demand for other occupations. New employee surveillance technology has also got many concerning aspects, and it's happening right now across American manufacturing, service, and other industries. So how do we balance the prosperity that this new technology promises with the needs of American workers? It's a tough question to answer, but we've assembled a diverse group of experts to help us take on this topic. We'll get their thoughts on the new technology innovations that are racing to market and the potential human ethical issues they raise. We'll also take a look at ways to ensure that the benefits of technological innovation also accrue to the workers whose jobs may be impacted. Let me introduce today's panelists. First of all, Amanda Ballantyne. Amanda Ballantyne, has devoted over 20 years to the organized labor movement. She's the executive director at the AFL-CIO's Technology Institute. She has a very important role within the AFL-CIO where she develops strategies to engage workers in the innovation process, which makes her an excellent contributor to today's panel, which focuses on how we can prepare society to engage with a more machine-driven world. Next, we've got Ayhan Nguyen, the program director of the Labor Futures Initiative at Data and Society. Aya's work focuses on emergent disruptions in the labor force due to data-centric technology and creating new ways of understanding these disruptions through evidence-based research and collaboration. Welcome, thank you. Next, we have Nina Schick. Nina Schick is a leading voice in generative AI. Nina wrote her groundbreaking book on AI-generated content, Deepfakes, in 2020, and she now focuses on advising several AI and technology companies in this rapidly expanding space. You can find her work on AI in Wired, the MIT Tech Review, the Times, Time, and many other places. And finally, but definitely not least, Danielle Van Leer, who is SAG-AFTRA's Senior Assistant General Counsel for Contracts and Compliance. In this role, she's responsible for managing SAG-AFTRA's third-party agreements and intellectual property and other efforts to protect the rights of SAG-AFTRA and its members. She's also an adjunct professor at Southwestern Law School, teaching entertainment guilds and trademark law courses. Danielle has written several amicus briefs and spoken to global audiences about deepfakes, among other issues, as well as AI and rights of publicity. So welcome to this amazing panel. All right, I'm going to sit down at the table next to you, and we'll get started. Okay, so let's talk about the big picture to start with. I'm going to ask all of you to respond to this as you choose. How can we better engage with a machine-driven world? What changes do you see as inevitable, and what changes do you think we can shape as part of the process of engaging with technological innovation? And why don't I start at the far end with Nina and work my way back towards me, if that's okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. In terms of engaging with a machine-driven world, I think the first place to start is just to conceptualize how big of a change is unfolding and how unprecedented that is. So if you look throughout history, technology has always transformed society. But if you look at the kind of big technical evolutions in the past, there's always been a little bit more time between each technological innovation that has allowed society to kind of figure out what's happening, how to adapt. But what's happening now is that the pace of change is exponential. So it no longer makes sense to think about society in the old ways we used to think about it. We need to think of entirely new economic systems, entirely new structures for society that are in line with just how quickly technology is changing society. And in particular, the kind of area that I focus on, generative AI, it's less than 10 years old. Some of the applications, which are just so utterly profound in terms of implications, not only for the workforce and automation, but just for human experience in and of itself, only emerged in the last 15 to 18 months. But yet, in the next 3 to 5 years, they're probably really radically going to change the workplace. So the first thing, as I mentioned, is just to understand that we're at this tipping point, that the pace of change is more profound than anything we've experienced before. And then following that, to think about engaging or building solutions or building systems, we need to be just as radical as the technology itself. So no longer thinking perhaps small term, but really thinking kind of what's the big picture here.
Nina, that's definitely one of the major messages we've been hearing in this room today is making sure that we're thinking broadly and big and not narrowly about the impact of technology. Can we turn to you and get your thoughts on this next?
Yeah, definitely. I want to talk about this inevitability of tech. And I think that the big thing to take away from that is that it's not inevitable for two reasons. One, I think particularly in labor, our ride-hailing system, our delivery system has been upended by Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing companies. But there's not even a clear sense that they will survive. Some of them are not profitable yet. So there's still a big question there on how we shape some of these technologies. And coming out of data and society, where so much of the work is about understanding what's promised by technology and how it actually functions in society are two different things. And I think recently I did some research into delivery drivers and their experiences in neighborhoods that are increasingly surveilled by smart machines. And these systems, Ring doorbells, but also Nest and all these systems are sold as safety and security tools. But what we found was that the vast majority of the time, they were worker management tools. So we can't necessarily assume that something will play out the way that it is. And I think given that, particularly as a lot of these tools are going to be affecting workers, we have to be really diligent in talking to workers to actually see how they impact them and are affected by them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aya. Amanda,
Well,
thoughts?
I want to sort of plus on what Iha is saying about the inevitability of tech. Certainly, there's enormous capital. There's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of pressure. It's a big tide that's moving artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other digital technologies. But there is room, and if we stand up and really, really kind of focus our efforts, there's room to kind of bend and shape and regulate these technologies. And I think that's going to be really critical in the next decade, in the next 2 decades, to shape the world in a way that we can live with dignity and that we can have democratic societies and that we can have a voice on the job and that we can have good jobs, right? We are behind the curve, I would say, as a labor movement in terms of understanding these tech trends, in terms of creating the capacity to get out in front of them and in powerful ways confront them. We have great stories, we have great pilot projects, we have great experiments. Part of our opportunity is to really come together as a movement and develop strategies to say, no, actually, if we're going to be using artificial intelligence, here's how you have to construct the data sets. Here's the transparency we need to be able to understand how these systems are making decisions about our lives. They have tremendous impact on our lives. And here's the accountability that corporations have to have when their tech systems go awry, because that is real people's lives that are impacted. It's people's wages, it's wage theft, it's people's health and health care, it's family decisions, it's access to mortgages and loans. And as a labor movement, it is probably inevitable that AI is a wave that's coming at us that we can't stop, but we really can stand up and start to talk about how it's used and where it's used and where it shouldn't be used in our society.
And Danielle.
Yeah, I don't, I think I echo mostly what has already been said. And the thing that I would just add, and I think that is a critical component, is education on it. I am constantly reading articles. Duncan and I are passing articles back and forth. A bunch of our other staff, our general counsel, Jeff Bennett and I are constantly sharing articles, critiquing them, discussing what they mean for our members. It's just really important. And you need to read stuff that you're not used to reading. Scientific American, Wired, all these tech publications. To me, it comes naturally as a, nerd born and raised since I was a wee thing. So I love reading this stuff. And I think, we're going to be seeing new education courses coming up. I've seen courses on AI and the law, AI and ethics. So we're starting to see more and more of that developing, and we're going to have a new generation of talent out there that, has been brought up as digital natives and, having studied all this stuff. And I think it just really goes back to, I think it's extraordinarily important. Nina talked a little bit about the issues with deepfakes and the misuse of AI. I see crazy things. I see our members' photos being put on into these apps by fans, and educating them that, these harmless, quote unquote, uses, one, they normalize a technology that actually does harm people. And they're, they're violating the terms of use for another thing. But these are not harmless things. And, I think it's going to be incumbent upon us as leaders to educate our members, to educate the public. I think we need to educate employers. We need to not shy away from putting out messaging, even if some of it is scary, even if, we're worried about how it's going to be construed by employers. It's going to be the only way to have an informed membership and informed populace as these technologies spread.
What an excellent point, Danielle, about being really open. And I think that's part of what the purpose of this panel and the summit is to help make sure we're all having that conversation. Nina, yesterday we talked about, in another panel, we were discussing the implications of generative AI, in one example of it being as it relates to performers. And just although obviously in your book you've written about deepfakes, you've written about the sort of the very harmful aspects that AI can have, there was some silver lining in the clouds as well in terms of sort of the long-term prospects for the continued need for humans to be involved in creation of creative works. Could you talk about that for a second?
Absolutely. So just taking a step back, because we've talked about AI, but the field of generative AI, which is a really new field of artificial intelligence, is really unique because essentially what it allows machines to do for the first time, this is something that computers couldn't do before, is to actually generate or create something new. And that thing that it creates can be thought of as anything that thus far we would have seen as unique to human creativity or intelligence. So perhaps some people in the room have already seen ChatGPT, which is a kind of AI tool that allows basically machines to talk to you in real time. It's kind of like talking to a real human. Or you've seen the AI-generated images, you've seen perhaps or heard of deep fakes, which is again another form of generative AI, which allows AI to clone the digital likeness of people, which is why obviously it's so relevant to the entertainment industry. But these are all very, very early applications of a technology that is going to completely transform the way we work. Because if you think about automation, we've talked about it in the context of, like the production line in a factory, but this is actually automating work that is a white collar job. So now using generative AI, you can do things like get the machine to generate your marketing copy, to generate even a legal text. So all of these kind of this isn't a silver lining. All of these kind of white collar jobs that we would have thus far assumed as being almost future proof in terms of being replaceable by a machine, the production process can now be done by AI. So where does that leave us ultimately? The human element, the curation, the understanding what's important. If these systems can be built in a way where they actually enhance our creativity and intelligence, can mean that it actually frees us up to focus more on what makes us uniquely human. I think in the former panel, one of the panelists said it was about critical thinking, it was about human connection. These are the things that matter. But of course, this is not inevitable. I agree with what both of the other panelists have said. What I do think is inevitable is that this technology is coming and it's going to be universally applied. But what isn't inevitable is that it has to disempower workers. And this is where we absolutely have to be engaged and understand the implications of these systems and how they're built.
Well, I think that's a great lead into a question I wanted to ask Amanda in particular, although anybody could also jump in. I think we've seen in the past some resistance in the part of society in general, and sometimes in the labor movement, to addressing directly the introduction of new technology, especially if we think there may be negative impacts on workers that come from it. And in the past, those efforts to just sort of resist full out have often failed. Do you think there is another way for labor to address the development of new technology and transitions into new technology that might be more effective?
Well, I think it's a complicated question, right? Because a lot of times labor unions, when they're resisting and automating technology, they're standing up for their members who are paying their dues in the, democratic process. So, so it's a tough position to be in, to have to, on the one hand, protect your existing membership against, a wave of automation that's coming, but also sort of anticipate kind of how to grow, develop, and change and pivot, right? So I think, using terms like better or worse is tough, right? Because these are human beings' lives, their pensions, their retirements, their healthcare, right? And we're in a very tough spot in society with all of these transitions that are happening. We don't happen to live in a country that takes care of people through transitions. In Germany, all of these types of tech transitions are really bargained. They're bargained between the government, between the firm that's involved, between the labor union, often the city or the municipality is involved. So there's a strategy to help people move through transitions in their workplace. That strategy involves bargaining, it involves training, upskilling, and it involves the sort of creation and economic development strategies that then create jobs in the places where people live. It's just not realistic to expect that people, when a plant closes, are going to be able to pick up their entire lives and move to find it. We've seen that for the past 40 years. Look at all of the places that have deindustrialized in this country and the real crisis that we have in Rust Belt cities, and why we're so excited and grateful about the CHIPS and Science Act and these other big industrial and infrastructure investments that are going to be made. Game changing, right? Game changing for cities and communities, game changing for our democracy. So that said, right? I mean, you cannot overlook the human, the catastrophic impact on people's lives of not having a rational system of just transition around technology. And that is a failing of our country. And it's something that we as a labor movement have to continue to take on and demand, right? Because there are places in the world that do that well, and we could be one of those places. At the same time, unions, and this is part of the work of the Technology Institute, it's been inspired by SAG-AFTRA and by other unions who've been very involved with the Tech Institute, can and should get upstream in the research and development process. We should be real stakeholders in shaping what the technology that's created through our tax dollars and our research and our public research and development money, and in really kind of adding and involving ourselves in that conversation. So the technologies that is created is what we would call good technology. It's technology that improves work, that makes work faster, safer, more equitable, right? So in the Science Act, the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act, there's this very exciting kind of string of legislation that requires, as a mandatory partner, the involvement of labor unions in several aspects of the U.S. research and development enterprise. So the TIPS Directorate at the National Science Foundation, which is the technology and innovation program that's sort of like working with NSF stakeholders on developing new technologies and innovations. Now labor is a required mandatory partner in that program. We're also a required mandatory program or partner in the testbed section of the CHIPS and Science legislation. That puts us in this sort of prototyping role. So where before it really would have been like corporations, universities, government, sort of figuring out how to develop and deploy this new technology, now labor and community groups are right there, required stakeholders. And then the third one is this technology hubs and innovation engines piece of the CHIPS and it's actually technology hubs, but we have a relationship with NSF and we're talking about the innovation engines. And that is really sort of putting labor in the circle of this sort of new industrial policy, technology policy, innovation policy, whatever you want to call it, that has been funded by the Biden administration, which is about these critical technologies that have been identified as sort of critical to U.S. competition in the global marketplace. They include things like AI and quantum computing and clean energy work, materials recycling, all of these things that are really the science solutions that we need to develop if we're going to move kind of ahead in a bunch of different areas. There's going to be massive investment in research and development around these types of technologies, and we put labor organizations right in the middle of that through this legislation, right? So I think that we can think in a big picture way about taking up more space in the research and development enterprise and making working people a core component and a core consideration of the funding and the technology that our tax dollars pay for. So that, I guess that's what I would say.
Great. No, I think that's a that's a very nuanced answer, and it gives us a lot to work with. Could I turn to you and ask you what you see as probably the most significant problem that's posed by AI and also by algorithmic management, something we can probably talk a little bit more about, as businesses embrace technology and are using it to collect data and actually engage in more autonomous algorithmic decision making. And as part of that, will you also address whether you think there's any sort of framework or solution that can be applied to help govern the use of that kind of technology?
That's a huge question.
Mm.
So I'll try
That's a
to
tough one, too.
answer. Yeah, I'll try to answer some of it. First of all, I don't think it's yet clear what all of the consequences of machine learning and AI are in employment. I think that's just slowly going to unfold. And it will be everything from automation to most of what I work on, which is surveillance and algorithmic management. And in that end, I think one of the things that it has done for labor, it's really quantified it. Labor is now quantified. Everything that one does has to be measured. And the reason why it's measured, why everyone wants things measured, is that then you're manageable, you're controllable. And so much of labor, from what many would call low skilled, but it's really just low pay work, to more creative work, there are forms of efforts to get by managers to get employees to measure their output, whether it's, how quickly a person in a warehouse is able to package something up to be sent out, to how many Twitter followers a journalist has. All of that is being used in order to measure productivity levels of workers. And so the consequence of that is that this information is now being used in order to determine working conditions and the outcomes of a worker's employment, everything from discipline to promotion and even termination. And it happens on multiple levels. It's on the individual level. The data can be used to specifically target one individual and claim that their behavior is deviant. It can also aggregate this information to sort of create an ideal employee and a metric by which everybody else should perform. And then it's also predictive in order to make essentially predictions or inferences about how someone will perform in the future. And so these are all bringing forward some really big, since this panel is about ethics, ethical questions about what are the guardrails? You know, at what point should workers' rights, workers' protection, workers' well-being be the other end of this efficiency and productivity? Where does that go? And so I think that, you know, related to what Amanda was saying about sort of like, as we're thinking forward, what are sort of the solutions or places where labor can be part of the conversation? In addition to developing good policies around tech development, there's a broader conversation about ethical tech. And I think this is a space where labor really needs to be more involved. From what I've seen, the legislation that's come out to protect workers, like the California Consumer Privacy Act, or in New York, there was a recent AI hiring audit legislation. The principles and the policies and the ethical code that governs that isn't necessarily what labor would want to hear, or is not enough for labor. Like the AI hiring audit is focused very much on bias, but doesn't look at issues of exploitation, doesn't talk about whether someone's union activity could be a basis for their being rejected for a position. And so, you know, I'm actually, a lot of this is around the language of fairness, accountability, and transparency. Justice is not part of that. And that is something that's probably very critical to the labor movement, that they should be part of that conversation. So, but I think what we're also seeing is that they're good thinkers who are starting to really see that algorithmic management and surveillance is not isolated. And it's something that does require a bigger framework. And so recently, the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel, Jennifer Abruzzo, recently announced that she's going to be looking at a new legal framework to provide protections for workers from, you know, near constant surveillance and the algorithmic management that can scale things like wage theft and termination without even giving any transparency or information to workers about how this happened.
Well, it's really interesting as we talk about this ethical framework, the different participants in determining what that ethical framework should be. And so, Danielle, I wanted to ask you what kind of obligations you think the tech companies themselves, especially the ones who are developing these AI technology tools, such as Google, but not only Google, what obligation do they have to make sure that those tools are used in an ethical manner? What do you think?
Legally, they don't have any, right? It's, you know, the legal approach to a lot of this stuff has been, we'll study it, we'll see where it's going. You know, DC is very slow to move here in the US. In other countries, they are looking at this much more closely, such as the EU has some legislation that they've been proposing about how AI is used and algorithms are used. So I think it comes down to, you know, human ethics and morality. And, you know, I go back to always the example I use. One of the first articles I read in connection with my deepfakes research was one titled, Google gave the world powerful AI tools and the world used it to create porn. I mean, that's the inherent nature, it seems, of people. Eventually, everything goes in this direction that's exploited. And, you know, they put out the first kind of major open source AI tool with really no frameworks, no guardrails around it, and kind of just trusted the scientific community to do what's right, you know, and I get the concept of putting it out open source because it does fuel research. And there's been hundreds and thousands of papers on what AI can do. And we have a lot of this technological development because of it. But at the same time, there's also been this rampant abuse because of it, because there are no guardrails in place. And, you know, I think the ethical question is really one not just of these companies, but it's the app developers in the middle. It's the users of it, as I mentioned, you know, people using these, you know, mobile phone apps and putting other people's photos in it. I was reading an article recently, you know, speaking of ethical codes, an AI, I believe it's in the UK, that was created to help people fight parking tickets, which, you know, isn't governed by the same legal ethics that lawyers are governed by. and people using Chat GPT now for a mental health, therapy. They're chatting with Chat GPT and similar apps. And it's such a tough question, that we have to examine as society. I literally just last night read an article, an AI ethicist who wrote an article about, it posited the question to Chat GPT about Santa Claus, and you would have this whole back and forth with the app about if Santa Claus is real, is it okay to tell a kid if Santa Claus is or isn't real? And whenever he asked, what do you think? Chat GPT's answer is, I'm an AI, I don't have personal beliefs, etc. And he made the point that Chat GPT speaking in the first person in and of itself has some ethical problems to it because it humanizes it. And Duncan sent me an article that I still haven't had a chance to read that I'm fascinated to read, which was two AIs discussing whether what to tell people about AI sentience. Was it, Duncan? So, I think this is a ongoing discussion that we really have to have at all levels. I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier, right? Education, these conversations at all levels of society. I think the industry needs to come up with its own ethical codes. Academics need to come up with their own ethical codes on this. One example, and then I'll shut up after that. But another area like Midjourney and OpenAI, a lot of these companies are affiliated with nonprofits, but they're creating like for-profit products. But as nonprofits, they're taking advantage of being able to make fair use of IP. And so they're basically, these for-profit companies are funneling their activities through a nonprofit or affiliating with nonprofits to essentially steal IP. And so there's an ethics conundrum there. I think they call it, in the data context, I believe they call it data laundering. Just like money laundering, you're using a pass-through entity to do what you couldn't do by yourself. And, I think it just raises, I think these conversations are very important. I've heard both pro and con at the sessions I've gone to today, the last few days from the technology community. I just think these need to keep happening.
Yeah, definitely. Yesterday we had another panel with a bunch of people from companies working in the entertainment industry using AI. And one of the questions that I posed to them, and I warned them in advance I was going to pose this question to them, was, what do you think about the rules, regulations, and guidelines that need to be applied to, in that case, AI as it relates to the entertainment industry, but in this case, more broadly, I think. And surprisingly, there was a recognition on the part of these folks who represented very large companies to smaller companies that there needs to be ethical guidelines and frameworks around the utilization of AI technology to make sure that people's human rights and image rights and other things are protected. So I'm curious to sort of ask the same question to this group, which is, Amanda touched on this a little bit in her remarks, more in terms of the government's involvement in programs designed to help workers, but specifically with respect to regulation or through collective bargaining or through industry standard setting. What do you think the mix should be? What do each of you think the mix should be in terms of how we define these guidelines and rules before this area gets too far gone to be constrained by ethical guidelines?
So I'm going to slightly edit the answer because I'm going to talk about something which hasn't come up yet, which is access. These are extremely powerful technologies, extremely powerful tools. And I think we all agree on this panel and in this room that kind of the AI revolution is coming and it's going to change the world very quickly in ways that we haven't even yet been able to imagine. And a kind of recent historical analogy is the internet, right? I mean, when it first was invented, people were like, no one's going to do anything with this. It's just for weirdos and porn, right? And now, just 30 years, a few decades later, it's absolutely transformed our lives. Every facet of human communication, human economic activity, personal communication goes through the internet, and we can't really imagine a life without it. The same is going to be true for all these AI-powered systems. We've talked about the ethics, we've talked about automation, we've talked about loss of jobs. These are all going to be very, very relevant questions. But what we haven't talked about is who controls the systems. Because if these technologies are only in the hands of private companies or very well-resourced actors, they're going to almost have superpowers to accumulate economic abundance, power, wealth on a scale that is unimaginable. So we absolutely need to make sure that AI, these systems and AI is accessible by the people and built with the people in mind, not only across socioeconomic groups, demographic groups, but also around the world. So I think that it's really, really important to think about basically how do we ensure that this almost becomes a new infrastructure for humanity where everybody can benefit, because there is going to be tremendous abundance created by it. There's going to be a lot of money and wealth. How do we make sure that that upside is distributed in a way that it only doesn't accumulate into the hands of a few players?
Thanks, Nina. Aya, what do you think about that?
I would definitely 100% agree with that. It really, a lot of it does come down to ownership and who gets to own, not just not only who does it affect, but who actually reaps the benefits from this advanced technology. Because the whole idea was that it was going to liberate people and everybody was going to be able to do what they wanted to do and be happier people, and that's not turning out to be the case. I think I'm gonna step back a little bit and talk about sort of like what can be done or what needs to be done before it's too late. I don't think it's too late. I think we've had experiences in the past where things have been put into place and then regulations and safeguards have been put in afterwards. I mean, cars and seat belts and speed limits and stuff like that, for example. And so one thing that is happening is many people are thinking about impact assessments. How do we actually think about the broader impacts of technology, regardless of what kind of technology, so that we're just not accepting that this is the rosy picture of how things will be, but actually looking at the impacts, and also not just for consumers, but for workers as well, because they're oftentimes on the other side of some of this technology. And I think it has to go beyond harm reduction. It's not enough for us to say we need to make sure that no worker is going to work grueling hours. It has to be about shared prosperity. It has to be about all of these other accrued benefits to workers so that this really does accomplish what it's supposed to do. In terms of impact assessments, this is kind of a new area, again, that labor needs to be at the table around. It doesn't really exist anymore, but we have impact assessments in human rights and environment and so many other realms. And so why isn't there one for AI and labor?
I think that's a great point, and I totally agree. The one thing I would say is that, it will take a lot of different types of management systems to adequately regulate and manage artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies. We should see this as a long project. And no, it isn't too late, but it's about to be too late, and we need to get started. I do think we need to, and Christina Kolkoff talked about this morning on one of this morning's panels. We have to think about not just legislation, regulation. We need to think about ongoing governance, because this is technology that is rapidly evolving. There are zillions of different use cases being produced all over the world. They're driving lots of different technologies. So I think in addition to sort of strategies that sort of create tangible ways to assess the technology and its impact, there needs to be ongoing governance with a broad set of stakeholders who are impacted in different ways and who have different kinds of expertise, right? One of the conversations we have often is about transparency. We need to understand the coding and how the systems are being decided, or how the systems are making decisions so that we can assess those impacts. But that is a really complicated question. Like, how do you clarify for workers or their bargaining agents how an AI is functioning, right? So there's a level of sort of like literacy, but also requirements on these companies about making transparency effective to a broader public. And I think the government has a really critical role to play in defining that and then creating enforcement mechanisms, because we know that employment law in the United States is basically unenforceable in most places because workers don't have the power or the money or the resources to get the legal kind of redress that they really need, unless they're very egregious violations or very big, violations. I don't mean to be like dour about it, but now imagine some of our legal systems that protect like low-wage workers trying to contend with big AI systems, right? How do individual people enforce their own rights without really sort of significant, transparent accountability systems? And so I think governance and ongoing governance is a really critical piece of this. And it's a conversation that I know they're having in Europe. We should be having it more effectively in the United States.
Danielle, as a lawyer, maybe you can also contribute as to, do you think that the legal system is ready for this? I know we've had some discussions about whether the copyright system is ready to deal with generative AI and the implications of the data, the training data that's brought into those systems. But on a broader scale, is that going to be an effective system for us dealing with this problem?
So I'm still stuck on Nina's comment about the internet 30 years ago and the fact that I've been on the internet for over 30 years and what that says about me. So you're kind of like throwing me off. It's a good question. I think yes and no. Our legal system tends to be very elastic and adaptable, and our system of common law, depending on which theories of jurisprudence you follow, which I have my concerns with our current Supreme Court, given that AI and all these technologies did not exist when the Constitution was written. I think generally speaking, there are ways, that our system is equipped to adapt to it. One of my big areas is, as you mentioned in the introductions, is rights of publicity and, name, image, likeness rights. And, those will adapt to this technology. Copyright, to some extent, will adapt to this technology. Trademark is trademark. It's going to take, cases making their way through the courts to reach that determination. But I think it's, I think there is going to be legislation needed, particularly as the others have said, in the context of labor and giving labor a seat at the table. I think there are going to need to be changes to our privacy laws. We are going to need better regulation around things like the deepfake pornography type stuff. But I think our system is equipped to handle it with some changes. To your prior question, though, about collective bargaining, I do want to make sure to point out some of the successes we've had in this area. And I want to give a shout out to that table back there, who, in particular, Sue-Ann Morrow, who has been very successful in negotiating some of our work in the space. We have had plenty of discussions with AI companies. We've had discussions with, our influencer agreement and our podcast agreements are very clear examples of, labor being able to adapt to these new technologies. And some of these things are on a case-by-case basis. But those folks back there, are being greatly innovative. And, I just need to say that I'm really excited getting to work with them on a regular basis on this stuff, because we are right there in the midst of it.
I wish we had double the time for this panel, but we don't. I'm warned that we're almost out of time, so that we can at least take one or maybe two questions, and then we'll have to wrap up. So I see one right here in the front. Kim, do we have a mic for Kim?
In the future, if I kill my AI, will I go to prison for murder? It's a thought.
Yeah. This is not legal advice, and That's an interesting question. Nina, you might know the state of those conversations in the UK better than I am. Where I first started studying it was in the UK and the EU. There's been a lot of discussion around AI personhood, not necessarily for the example you posit, but for the opposite. Who's responsible when a self-driving Tesla car drives off the road and into a wall and kills somebody? It's again another question of the ethics, the law, and the adaptation. Nina, do you know where the conversations are on
It all
over
comes
there?
down to the question of accountability, right? Like if the system malfunctions and it's a machine, who's going to take accountability? But I love your question about killing your AI.
Where it has actually come up is there have been some questions, again with the metaverse, and there are some games that have come out where, like, if your character is dead, it's permanently dead, and there have been some like ethical kind of curious debates over what would happen. Is a murder if you kill your AI avatar in one of these virtual worlds, and I don't think there's a legal answer to it. I think that'll come down to terms of use and litigation for that. But it's those are very interesting questions.
And maybe the answer will be different when we have truly sentient AI. So we'll have to come back to that question, Kim, maybe
Next year, No, I'm
next
just kidding.
month, next year,
Yeah.
or
No.
in 1,000 years. We don't know. Okay, I think we maybe have time for one more question. Is there one? Or if not, we'll wrap up because we are a little bit over time. Okay, I think we're good. So I just want to say thank you so much to this amazing panel. Nina Schick, Aya Nguyen, Amanda Ballantyne, and Danielle Van Leer. What tremendous contributions you have made. And with that, our 4th annual Labor Innovation and Technology Summit is complete. I'd like to send a huge thank you to our partners at the AFL-CIO, especially President Liz Schuler and Secretary Treasurer Fred Redmond, for continuing to be inspirational and innovative leaders who remain steadfast in their support for labor. And of course, to the American Federation of Teachers and Unite Here, we at SAG-AFTRA are especially grateful for your continued partnership. I also want to thank the staff who worked so hard to put this exceptional event together, and all of the panelists and guests who shared their insights and wisdom. Your generosity is truly a gift. And last but absolutely not least, a huge thank you to all of you, the union members and supporters, without whom there would be no summit, no union, and no way forward. You are the background and the foundation of all that we do and strive to achieve.